the hill of freedom, a place for those who've lost everything. Have you ever felt like you no longer had a name to be called by, no place to return to, and no reason left to keep living? Have you ever wished, just once, that someone amid the thousands rushing by would pause and ask you something simple? Are you cold? This story doesn't begin with light. It begins at an old train station, a girl shivering in the mountain wind, and a man passing through life like a shadow. But some encounters aren't fate, they are karma. Some shattered souls don't meet to fall in love, but to save each other. And then, like a seed falling on barren soil, a miracle began to sprout. Tierra Blanca, a land seemingly forgotten by time, welcomes dawn with the howl of wind through the cliffs and dust clinging to the boots of wanderers. No one gets off the train here without a clear reason. Except her. The girl had no name. Or maybe she once did. But it was buried somewhere between nights of screaming, locked doors, and slaps that hardened her heart before her body had a chance to grow. The train screeched to a halt. Passengers disembarked, calling each other's names, chatting in haste. She sat still until the very last moment. Only when the ticket master, an old man with a silver beard and tired eyes, placed a hand on her shoulder did she finally rise. Without a word. In her hand was a faded cloth bag patched with a piece of fabric shaped like a flower. It held only a few things, a few clothes, a torn notebook, and a small knife. But the thing she held onto most tightly was a fragile hope that somewhere, beyond those mountains, there might be a place where she could simply exist. She stepped off the train like a withered leaf falling from its branch, carried by the wind to wherever it may land. She walked along the main road lined with only 4 old buildings. A closed-down barber shop, a grocery store thick with cobwebs, a bar reeking of alcohol, and a run-down inn with peeling paint on its door. She asked for a place to stay for the night. The innkeeper, with eyebrows drawn as if with ink, looked her up and down before shaking her head. No rooms for women traveling alone. I have money. I'll pay by the night. It's not about money here. The door closed. Firmly. Just like every other door had closed in her life. At the police station, a man named Rojas, his hat and gun resting on the desk, asked curtly. Name? I don't have one. Everyone has one. Not when the world wants to forget you. No one was surprised. No one looked at her like a person. They looked at her like she was a problem or a curse lingering around town. The sun set. Winds from the forest swept in, biting into her spine. She curled up beside the abandoned station wall. People passed by, glancing, but no one stopped. No one offered a bite of bread, a sip of water, or even an unjudging gaze. As night fell, she snuck into the equipment shed behind the station, unlocked, unnoticed. She curled up like a stray cat, clutching the rusty knife against her chest. Not for defense, but as a reminder. She was still alive. Footsteps. Laughter. Men from the bar were approaching. Heard there's a no-name girl in town, one voice said, pushing at the door. And then a shout, sharp as fire slicing through darkness. Altamirano. Just a name. One word. Like a spell. They retreated. No one dared look back. Inside, she held her breath until she heard only wind. Someone passed by. No words. No rush. A tall figure, wrapped in a dark cloak, moved like wind but left behind a blanket and a cup of coffee. Still warm. She looked around. No one. Just her and the silent gift left behind, like a hidden bodhisattva offering a flicker of warmth on a frozen night. When the first ray of sun shyly pierced the thin mist covering Tierra Blanca, she had already been awake for a while. Sleep came in fleeting breaths fragmented like her memories. No dreams. No nightmares. Just a white space stretching between exhaustion and the thinnest thread of hope. The blanket was draped over her. Still warm. As if someone's hand had just withdrawn in silence. Beside her, the metal cup still held warmth. Coffee. No sugar. Bitter. But she drank it all. Not because she was thirsty. But because for the first time in what felt like forever someone thought she was worth offering a cup of morning coffee to. She didn't cry. Her tears had long dried up back in the place with iron doors, screaming voices, and punishments for women who didn't obey. She stepped out of the shed. The morning wind blew through her tangled hair. Mist lingered, but the dust never stopped rising with her every step. She walked the main road aimlessly. Still clinging tightly to her cloth bag, her knife inside. A relic. A reminder that even cast out by the world, she still possessed one small thing. The right to keep herself. Every door was closed. The grocery store. The bakery. The barber shop. Even the barking dogs seemed eager to chase her out of this town's breath. No one asked where she came from. No one cared why a quiet, nameless woman with no past appeared like a blot of ink on the faded page of this old town. To them, she was a curse. Something that shouldn't exist. A face polite society preferred not to see. She no longer knocked. No more begging. Only a silent wish for a dry spot beneath an overhang. Evening fell. The clouds thickened. In the fading light, she returned to the shed where she had stayed the night before. But this time the door was locked. A brand new padlock hung on it. She wasn't surprised. Wherever a no-name girl existed, doors would be shut forever. She turned toward the back of the forge where a few old crates and dirty rags lay. A corner of the wall, just big enough to curl into. The wind cut deeper there. The air smelled of iron, oil, and ash like a warning, this place is not for the weak. And once again footsteps. She didn't turn around. She only gripped her bag tighter. Her hand found the rusty knife not to strike but to remind herself. I am not yet erased. A tall figure appeared. Black cloak. Deep eyes. Boots dusty but polished. A scar stretching across one brow like a memory of war. Altamirano. The man who chased away the drunken men the night before. He asked nothing. Commanded nothing. He simply placed a bundle of bread wrapped in a clean cloth next to her. No words. Why? She finally asked for the first time in days. Not with suspicion. Just honest confusion. He didn't look at her. He simply said, "It's not charity. It's respect." Then he turned away, gentle as the breeze. Not expecting gratitude. Not needing thanks. That night, it rained hard. Tierra Blanca was torn apart by thunder. Rain slammed onto metal roofs, water rushing like a flood of past lives crashing back with no mercy. She huddled beneath the eaves, the bread clutched to her chest. Cold. Hungry. But strangely not alone. Because in the downpour a horse emerged. Altamirano. Cloaked. Hat pulled low. He said little. He just stopped the horse and held out his hand. Get on. Where are we going? She asked, voice trembling. To a place where you won't have to curl up to sleep. She hesitated. Then like a bird too weary to fly in the storm she reached out and grasped his shoulder. Not for support. but because for the first time someone didn't push her away. They said nothing more on the ride. The horses' hooves thudded on the muddy road. The wind howled through their clothes. But warmth from Altamirano's back traveled to her like a quiet promise. Some people don't rescue others, but by simply existing, they make others want to live again. His house stood a few miles from town. Low roof. Thick walls. An oil lamp flickered like a fragile heartbeat. No fence. No nameplate. Just a quiet place enough for the wind to pass through without blowing away the breath of two lost souls. Altamirano stabled the horse, then opened the door. The fire was already lit. A pot of beans simmered on the table. And the single bed was made with thick blankets. "Tonight, this bed is yours." She stood there, still not knowing who she was. But for the first time in a very long while, she knew. There was one place in the world where a door did not shut on her. "Do I owe you anything?" "No," Altamirano replied, setting down his hat. "But you're not alone anymore." The next morning, she woke up in real warmth. Not an illusion, not the lingering body heat from moldy childhood dreams. But the warmth of an actual home. The blanket was tucked up to her neck. Her clothes were still damp, but her chest no longer ached from curling up in the cold. The fireplace hadn't gone out completely, embers still glowed beneath half-burnt logs. In the stillness of the house, there were no chains clinking, no barking orders, no metal doors slamming shut like the mornings in her father's camp. Only the gentle crackle of fire. Like an old grandmother's voice, patient and quiet, asking for nothing but someone to listen. The room wasn't large, but it was clean. A simple wooden bookshelf. A faded photograph on the wall. A stern-faced man beside a little girl trying to suppress a smile. No one had to explain, she knew this was a family that once lived here. Once. When she walked into the kitchen, the table was already set. Sliced bread, hot stewed beans, and 2 cups of coffee. On her cup, the milk foam had been clumsily shaped into a flower. Crooked, but clearly intentional. She froze. For the first time, someone had done something not to control her, but simply to make her feel worthy of something small. She sat down and ate slowly. Each spoonful of beans sank into her hollow stomach like sunlight filtering into an abandoned room. Through the window, she saw Altamirano near the horse stable, repairing the fence. His sleeves rolled up, he drove each nail into the wood slowly, carefully. As if he were mending something far greater than an old fence. He didn't look up. Didn't wave. But with every strike of the hammer, it was as if he was sealing away a piece of darkness within himself. And somehow, that gave her peace. When he came inside and set the hammer on the wooden table, she stood up awkwardly. Thank you." He didn't respond. Just placed a dry towel on the bed. "If you want to wash, I heated water out back. Just a big wooden tub, with some fabric draped for cover. Not fancy, but it's clean." She looked at him. For the first time, a man had offered her a bath. Without expecting anything in return. No probing stares. No commands. No hidden meanings. Just simply. "You deserve to be clean. And I respect that." Behind the house, there was a small, carefully shielded corner. The old tub was filled with steaming water. No one watched. No one lurked. She undressed, piece by piece, revealing scars old, new, deep, faded. Like a map of a life people never wanted to talk about. She stepped into the water and shivered. Not from cold, but from the feeling of being cleansed. Of all the things that once made her believe she was filthy. She didn't sob aloud. Only let the tears fall, blending silently into the hot water. As if her soul were melting, dissolving gently, with no witness. And no need for one. When she returned to the house, there was a simple outfit laid on the bed. A white shirt, a coarse cotton skirt, and an old scarf that smelled faintly of pine. Not new clothes, but folded neatly. Neatly like someone folding up memories. So they wouldn't crush each other and make it hard to breathe. No one said it out loud. But it was clear. He had prepared. And he believed she would come back. That evening, they ate together. By the fire. A pot of chicken soup, 2 sets of wooden bowls and spoons. And silence. But no longer the silence of suspicion or strangeness. It was the silence of 2 people who didn't need words to know. They were not alone. Have you always lived alone? For a long time. And why did you bring me here? Altamirano took a sip of water, paused for a long moment, then said, because you were soaking wet. And I didn't want to see one more soul washed away in the storm. She laughed soft, crisp. Like the sound of a spoon tapping the bottom of a bowl. You think I still have a soul? This time, he looked her straight in the eyes. Deep, but not judging. Yes. But it's tired. She went quiet. For the first time, someone hadn't called her crazy, or broken, or that thing. Just tired. And for the first time, she wasn't ashamed of being tired. The next morning, she woke up before dawn. Not out of fear like the long nights of her past. But because, for the first time, she wanted to do something for herself. She picked up the old broom leaning in the kitchen corner. And quietly swept the yard. Golden straw from the roof, dry leaves, pebbles. Each piece collected like fragments of a scattered life she was trying to piece back together. She didn't clean to repay a debt. Not because Altamirano asked. She cleaned because something inside her was beginning to grow. Very small. But unmistakable. A sense of belonging. From inside the house, Altamirano watched through the window. He didn't call out. Didn't stop her. Just observed. Calmly, like a meditating Buddha who never interferes with another's path. She worked until her arms ached, her back soaked in sweat, and the sun stood high. When she entered the kitchen, there was already a glass of water on the table. No words. No explanation. She understood. He saw. And he understood. That afternoon, as the sunlight slanted across the porch, Altamirano placed a small cloth bag on the table. Inside were a few coins and a straw hat. Tomorrow I'm heading to the market to trade a few things. Would you like to come along? She looked up, eyes wide. I can go. The question is, do you want to? She looked at her hands. Calloused, scarred. At her feet. That once ran, once collapsed. But today, she stood. And her heart, still fragile, was beating for something beyond fear. Yes. The next morning, they left while mist still clung to the road. She didn't hold Altamirano's hand. They weren't lovers. Not best friends. Not kin. But she walked beside him. Step for step, without hesitation. They passed through the market gates, just a few tarp-covered stalls. A handful of people bartering chickens, eggs, dry bread, and seeds. But the stairs were many. and the whispers buzzed like a broken hive. "Who's that girl? I heard he picked her up. She must be a runaway, look at her, not even ashamed." She heard every word, each one like a needle to her skin. But she didn't look back, didn't cry, didn't bow her head. She just walked closer to Altamirano. At the produce stall, the shopkeeper Soledad, round-bodied, sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, looked at her like a caterpillar in a rose garden. 3 pumpkins and a quarter kilo of beans. How much? Soledad sneered. 3 for 1 coin, but I don't sell to the nameless. Altamirano replied calmly. Then I'll pay 2. 1 for the pumpkins, and 1 to soften your mouth. Without waiting, he placed the money down and handed her the bag. No more words. But she understood. For the first time in her life, someone had stood up for her with no strings attached. That evening, they returned home early. After placing the vegetables in the kitchen, Altamirano led her down a narrow path behind the house. A trail winding through dry, rustling trees. No one spoke. She didn't ask. They stopped at a low mound under an old chestnut tree. 2 simple wooden crosses marked the spot. He knelt. No tears. No prayer. Just a dried flower, gently placed at the grave. "Who were they?" she asked softly. "Emilia, my wife. And Clara, my daughter." She said nothing. Kneeled beside him. Didn't touch him. Didn't console. Just stayed. Because sometimes, silence says more than sorrow. "And you?" he asked. "Did you ever have a name?" She swallowed hard. "Yes. But one day, my father tore it out of my mouth. Like someone ripping a dress off a girl. He said women don't need names. Only obedience." Altamirano clenched his hand on his knee. Not angry at her, but at the world. After a long silence, he said, "You can choose again. A name for yourself." She pressed her lips together. "I don't know what to choose." "Then, do you know Spanish?" She nodded. "Then let it be loose. Light." She looked at him. Eyes once hardened, now soft with tears. "You think I deserve that name?" "It's not what I think. It's what I've already seen." That night, before bed, she stood in front of the mirror. A small cracked mirror hanging on the wall. She placed her hand over her chest. Loose. No one had called her that. But she whispered it to herself. For the first time, she didn't need anyone's permission to exist. That morning, dawn didn't come with the crowing of roosters. It arrived in the scent of bread baking in the stone oven, the aroma of basil mingling with soft smoke, and the sound of a wooden knife tapping against a chopping board. Luz woke up still wearing the thin shirt from the day before, her bare feet carrying her into the kitchen. Altamirano was chopping vegetables, his face expressionless, but his eyes gentle like the heat from a hearth. He didn't ask how she slept. Didn't ask what she dreamed. He just poured her a cup of tea and slid it quietly across the table. That was something Luz was starting to learn. Some men don't need to ask to understand. That morning, she asked for something. Not clothes. Not money. Not a place to stay. But, a job. "I want to help," she said, nervously twisting the corner of her shawl. "Not because I owe you. But because I want to feel needed." Altamirano paused, then nodded. "There's a chair out back with a broken leg. If you can fix it, it'll be the first seat for any stranger who visits this house." She looked at him, then chuckled softly. "Is this a test?" "No," he replied. "It's a beginning." Luz carried the chair out to the porch. Beneath the canopy of trees, sunlight filtered through in patches, like golden droplets lost on their way. She sat down, pried out each old nail, measured the leg's angle. Not because she knew carpentry, but because her hands had been worn from janitor work in packing plants, wiping tables, fixing leaky pipes. All the jobs no one ever paid fairly for. The old calluses on her palms helped her feel something most people forget. Labor is a form of meditation. A healing that comes through motion. By noon, the chair stood again. Not pretty, but solid. She sat on it, listening to the wood creak like a long sigh. But the sigh of something saved from the trash heap. Altamirano passed by, a sack of seeds in his hand. He said nothing, just brushed his fingers against the back of the chair. A touch lighter than wind. A silent kind of praise. That afternoon, Luz went with Altamirano to the market again. This time, she didn't walk behind him. She walked beside him. No longer dodging judgmental stares. No longer needing to explain who she was. At the edge of the market, a blonde girl no more than 8 years old ran up to her and held out a hand. "You're the gardener from the hill, right? My mom said you made Mr. Altamirano remember how to smile." Luz froze. She didn't know what to say. The little girl placed a dried daisy into her hand, then ran off. Altamirano, seeing it, just smiled gently. No words. None needed. Because in that moment, Luz understood something. The woman who once had no name, had now been recognized by an action. That evening, back at the house, Altamirano left a notebook on the table. Worn leather cover. The pages slightly yellowed. Nothing written inside. "For you." What is it? A place to write your name again. Your history. You can start at any point. Luz took the notebook, her fingers trembling. She hadn't written anything since the day they forced her to sign the voluntary inpatient treatment papers. She had once believed that writing was a tool others used to control her. But this time, the notebook was hers. Free. No one to read it. No one to judge. That night, Luz sat by the fireplace, pen in hand. But she didn't write about her father. Or the mental ward. Or escape. She wrote a single line. "Today, I am called Luz. Not because someone gave me that name. But because I chose it." Tierra Blanca had no post office. But news traveled like smoke through mountain wind. No loudspeakers were needed. Just a glance sideways, a whisper or two. And somehow, the past found its way back. Even when you'd buried it with every swept yard and every nightmare-less night. That morning, while Luz was hanging blankets by the eastern fence, she heard the distant sound of unfamiliar hooves on the dirt road from town. The wind shifted. And the air, which just days ago had carried the scent of wild grass and firewood, suddenly turned heavy, like a curtain pressing against her chest. Altamirano stepped onto the porch. He said nothing. But his hand slid instinctively toward his belt, where a small pistol rested. He wasn't afraid. But he knew sometimes a gun isn't for firing, but for reminding the world you're still standing. The first man appeared. A black suit, white hat, and a tie tied like a priest's collar. Beside him were two others, silent, but eyes circling like vultures sniffing out old blood. And then came the last. A man Luce didn't need 2 seconds to recognize. The one who used to be called father. He hadn't aged much. But his shoulders had slumped noticeably. That same worn coat. The one he always wore while lecturing with a voice colder than iron was still there. Luce used to think, if he disappeared, my life would be better. But now he stood before her flesh and blood. And what made her tremble wasn't fear. It was the disgust she felt toward herself. For still noticing how fast her heart was beating. "Come home," he said. His voice hadn't changed. Still hard, still cold. Still like a dull blade dragging across the wrist. "The game's over." She said nothing. Altamirano stepped forward. No introduction needed. His presence was a shield. But her father looked straight at Luce. As if Altamirano were just a servant. "They're from the court," the old man said. "They brought documentation. You're still underage according to the file. They have the right to take you back." Luce stepped up, hands clutching her coat. "They brought papers. But I carry scars." The man, her so-called father, didn't he blink. "You're living illegally. With a strange man. No one knows what's happened to you. If you think people will side with a runaway girl." Altamirano spoke, his voice low, but solid as stone. "She didn't run. She was reborn." The man in the suit pulled a file from his coat. "By law, her father can reclaim her. And if needed, we can use force." Luce's voice didn't waver. Her eyes never left her father. "What law allows a man to torture his daughter? By locking her in a mental institution. Just because she refused an arranged marriage." No one answered. Only the wind screamed through the dry trees behind them. "I'm not going back," she said, each word deliberate. "Not because I hate you. But because I've learned how to love myself." Her father sighed. As if forgiving a foolish child. But he didn't know. That child had died the day he signed the form. Allowing a doctor to inject poison into her arm. As they turned to leave, the suited man left a copy of the court papers on the table. His eyes lingered on Altamirano. As if to say something. But Altamirano simply returned the gaze. Not with anger. But with a stillness that made men want to look away. When they disappeared beyond the pine line, Luce sat on the porch step. Her hands were shaking. But her eyes were dry. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. "They will," Altamirano said. "But next time, it won't be just with paper." "What if they take me?" He said nothing. "I'm not afraid," she said. "I'm just scared. That I'll become no one again." Altamirano pulled the small notebook from his pocket. The one where she'd written her first lines. "This land, this house. They don't have official stamps. But if you want, I'll carve your name into the doorway. As a way to say, you lived here. And you were someone." Luce looked at him. Not with the eyes of a woman in love. But with the gaze of a survivor. Who'd found an ally in the desert. That night, she wrote one more line in her notebook. "If they come again, I will not go quietly. I will carry my voice. And I will let it echo through the ones who come after me." That night, Luce didn't sleep. Not out of fear. But because she was writing. As if stopping would give the old pain a chance to creep back in. And steal the body that had just learned to stand tall. She didn't write fast. Not perfectly. Not to reread. But each word, each sentence. was a chain link breaking loose from the invisible collar that had held her for years. I was once the daughter of a man who had the legal right to kill the human part of me without consequence. I was once a patient of a doctor who used medicine to silence screams he didn't have the courage to hear. I was once a problem to people who thought women were born to obey and smile while being dragged out of their own dreams by the hair. But now, I am loose. And I choose to tell my story. Not for revenge, but so no one else has to live in the dark like I did. The next morning, Altamirano found her asleep at the table, her head resting on the open notebook. Sunlight streamed through the window, falling gently on her messy hair, illuminating the shaky handwriting. Not pretty, but alive, like fresh blood. He didn't wake her, just draped a soft blanket over her shoulders, then placed a small violet flower, the kind that only blooms when the ground is truly cold, on the final page. That afternoon, as they were mixing soil to plant pumpkins behind the house, a stranger passed by the fence. He didn't enter the yard, just stood outside, hat pulled low, voice trembling. "Are you the one writing about yourself in the notebook?" Luz turned, cautious but not hostile. "I happened to read a copied excerpt," he continued, "from a friend in town. I was once a survivor too, of a marriage that felt like a prison." He pulled out a letter and held it up. "I don't want anything. Just, if you're writing, please write for those who still can't speak." Then he bowed his head and walked away. In Luz's hand was the envelope. Inside, scrawled and shaky handwriting read, "I'm not brave enough to go public. But if you write, then you're writing for me too. Please, don't stop." That night, in the small kitchen, Altamirano stoked the fire and quietly grilled corn cakes. Luz held the letter, then opened her notebook. She didn't continue her own story. She began the story of the nameless ones. At the top of the page, she wrote in bold strokes, "They were once too." With an old pen and a patience only those who've had their voice stolen can possess, Luz began writing down history, not just her own, but the stories of all who'd been forced into silence. By fear, by law, by the distorted meaning of the word family. Altamirano watched her from across the table. He didn't ask what she was writing. But when their eyes met, Luz said, "I don't just want to stay. I want others to have somewhere to go." "You're building a home," Altamirano replied. "But with words. With paper. With courage. And with your presence," she added. That night, they built a small wooden box and placed it outside the front door. On the lid, Altamirano carved with his knife, "For those who arrive without a name." Inside, Luz placed a second notebook, pure white, and a pencil. And from that day forward, anyone who came by, anyone abandoned, anyone unsure if they still deserved to live was invited to stay. No documents required. No proof of worth. Only one thing: the courage to write their name. Tierra Blanca didn't have calendars or clocks that worked on time. But every villager knew this. If 3 owls flew over the village at dawn, something unusual was about to happen. That morning, 3 low hoots echoed from the ridge behind Altamirano's house. No one spoke. But the wind carried the scent of cold smoke and the sound of hooves echoing from the far valley, like the past returning to collect a debt. Altamirano was tending the fire when he paused. Luz, mid-sentence in a new notebook, looked up. She knew. Not with logic, but with the instinct of a creature that had once been cornered. "They've come back," she whispered, setting down the pen. "This time, they're not just bringing papers." He nodded. Didn't ask what she planned. Didn't say stay inside. He simply stepped to her side, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. Like someone touching a cracked statue they don't want to shatter, because it's already survived too much. The hoofbeats grew clearer. 5 men. 3 on horseback. 1 wore a leather coat with a shiny new badge, the newly appointed sheriff. The 4th, in a suit, was the same lawyer now with a leather briefcase and official warrant in hand. And the last was her father. None of them dismounted immediately. They halted at the fence like cavalry before a crypt, awaiting the commander's word. Her father hadn't aged much since the last time, but his face looked scorched, like stone that had passed through both fire and ice and still refused to crack. Maybe it was failure failing to break his daughter that had hardened him into that shape. "Luce," he called. "Not my child. Not dear. Nothing. Just her name." For the first time, he called her by the name she had chosen, not one he had given. Luce stepped out onto the porch, hands empty. No fear. No trembling. She wore a coarse earth-toned dress, an old wool shawl, and held a leather notebook. The sole artifact of her resurrection. "They've come to take me back," she said directly. The lawyer nodded. "We have a court order confirming his guardianship rights." And Altamirano stepped forward, voice low like distant thunder. "And if she refuses, she may be deemed legally incompetent. Subject to forced return. On grounds of danger to herself and others." Luce laughed dry and brittle, like burnt leaves. "Dangerous because I write? Because I talk about being locked up, drugged, silenced." Her father edged his horse forward. He didn't raise a whip, but his gaze could kill a weak-hearted child. "I gave you everything. Reputation. Shelter. Education. And what did you give me? Shame. Scandal. A daughter who lives like a stray." Luce stood in silence, then slowly raised her notebook. This is what I give the world. And what you never had the courage to face. The truth." The sheriff opened his mouth, but Altamirano spoke first. "If you want a legal battle, go ahead. But this woman doesn't need rescue. She needs recognition." The lawyer shook his head. "We didn't come to argue morality. We're here to enforce legality." "Then," Luce said, opening the notebook, voice echoing like a bell on stone, "add this line to the record. Today, I was ordered to return to the man who caged me like an animal. But I chose to stand, not run. And if they take me, they'll be taking my story. And the stories of everyone like me." Silence. Taut as a bowstring. The wind stopped. Birds fell mute. Even the village dogs seemed to hold their breath. Then, the sheriff sighed. "I'm not here to drag a woman away from the life she's building. Especially one that's helping others. But I'll have to report that you refuse to return." "Then report," Luce said calmly, "that I am no longer anyone's possession." Her father stared at her for a long time. As if, for the first time, he saw her not as his child, but as a human being. And then he turned his horse. Said nothing. No threats. No promises. Just a fading shadow in the red dust of the western dusk. When they were gone, Altamirano turned to Luz. She was still standing. Still breathing. But her hands were clenched pale. "I didn't fall," she said like a vow. "Not this time." "No," he nodded. "This time, you truly are Luz." After that fateful confrontation, Luz was no longer a fugitive. She no longer had to justify her existence. She was someone who chose to stay. Not because someone allowed it, but because she decided so. From that day on, the house atop the hill wasn't just shelter for a woman and a quiet man. It became a still point in a loud world. A place for anyone carrying wounds society refused to acknowledge. One morning, a girl with tangled hair and fear in her eyes knocked on the door at dawn. No luggage. Just a crumpled paper and one question. "Is this the place where they give you water before asking where you're from?" Luz smiled. She handed the girl a cup of ginger tea and a blank sheet of paper. "You don't need to explain anything yet. Just write your name." The girl's name was Anna. But when she left her parents' house, they called her spoiled. Here, Luz called her someone starting over. The rumor spread fast in Tierra Blanca. Some mocked. Some scoffed. Called the house a runaway women's camp. But soon, even those who mocked began sending people there when they didn't know how else to help. A girl who hadn't spoken in 3 years after being abused. A young mother fleeing an abusive husband with her baby. A former teacher who lost her voice after exposing corruption. Each one was welcomed the same way. With warm water. A seat by the fire. And a blank page. Luz built a small extension beside the old house, roofing it by hand. Outside, a rough wooden sign read, "For survivors. No name required. Only courage." Altamirano helped her. Not with speeches, but with action. He forged tools, patched barrels, planted more vegetables. Widened the patio so more people could sit. He didn't speak much. But on cold nights, when she wrote by the oil lamp, he would place a log into the fire. And that was enough. Enough to remind her. She was with someone who didn't need to understand everything. Just someone who would never leave. One evening, as a gentle rain fell, Luz opened her old notebook again. The first page held that trembling line. "Today I am called Luz not because someone gave me the name, but because I chose it." She flipped to the last page and added, "Now, that name is not just light for me. It's a spark for those still walking through the dark." At that moment, Altamirano entered, carrying a bundle of firewood. "What are you writing?" he asked. "A list," she replied. "Of all the people who once didn't dare say, 'This is who I am,' and who now have found their voice." He set the wood down and sat beside her. "There was a time I was afraid of the name I chose," she admitted. "Afraid it wasn't worthy. Afraid it was just a shell. And now." Luz looked at him, eyes clear as the sky after a storm. "Now I know. Luz isn't light that shines on me. It's fire that burns from within me." Spring didn't come to Tierra Blanca with birdsong or blooming flowers along the hillsides. It came with letters. Not letters with stamps, postmen, or clear recipients. But hurried scraps of paper tucked into the nameless mailbox on Luz's porch. One morning, while Luz was sweeping the yard, she found a folded note under a rock beside the lavender pot. "I saw my name in your story. Not exactly the same, but it was me. I haven't found the courage to show up. But if you're reading this, know. Someone out there is surviving because of what you wrote. Signed, Nobody." Luz didn't cry, but her heart clenched, as if held tightly by a hand from afar. Gentle, invisible, yet more real than any grip her father ever used to control her. She placed that note in a small wooden box with a lock, beside the few sacred items she had kept. A worn scrap of fabric embroidered with the letter L. The last button from the shirt she wore when she was locked away. The first paper where she ever wrote her name. And now, a letter from nobody. It was an altar to survival. Not to worship any deity, but to honor the moments she thought she had died, but didn't. In the days that followed, more letters arrived. No one ever saw who brought them. Some were wedged in tree branches. Some slipped under the door. One tied to the leg of a neighbor boy's chicken. Another read, "I'm the wife of the man everyone in town fears. But after reading about how you refused to bow, I started standing up when he screamed in my face." Signed, someone learning to say no. Altamirano read those letters with Luz each evening after dinner. He didn't comment, didn't praise, didn't shed tears. But each time they finished a letter, he added more wood to the fire, as if keeping the flame alive was the only way to honor the faith of those too afraid to knock. One windy afternoon, a strange boy appeared at the gate. He was the son of a woman who had fled the village 3 years ago. A woman once called whore, homewrecker, dishonor. The boy was maybe 9. But his eyes no longer held the light of an ordinary child. He said, "My mom said, if there's any safe place, it's here. She asked me to give you this." He handed her a cloth pouch. Inside was a scarf embroidered with 2 words, freedom. Luz hugged the boy. Didn't speak. Didn't ask. She just knelt to his level and whispered, "Thank you, for trusting me." That night, Luz wrote a new entry in the large notebook she called The Book of Survivors. They don't come for pity. They come because they want to live without pretending to be someone else. They come without apology for existing. And if I was once the first to open the door, then now, there are dozens of hands holding that door open so it never closes again. Altamirano watched her quietly as she wrote. He wasn't a man who spoke easily about feelings. But that night, when she set the pen down, he said, "You've rewritten the definition of home." "Not on my own," she replied. "Your silence became the foundation." He nodded. Took her hand. A hand that once trembled, now calloused, but steady. He didn't squeeze too tightly. Didn't pull her toward him. He just held it, like someone holding a candle in the wind. At day's end, they sat on the porch steps. The wind blew from the distance. The house was still old, but now it had more chairs, more blankets, more words taped to the walls, and a quiet faith drifting through the air. Here, you don't have to be perfect. If you're still breathing, you still have the right to stay. With each passing week, Luz was no longer the only one writing in the Book of Survivors. The large leather notebook was now placed in the center of the kitchen table. Unlocked, no permission needed. Anyone who entered could write in it. There were no grammar rules. No corrections. No one checked the spelling. Only one rule. Be real. A woman named Teresa, once forced by her brother to marry a man 20 years older, was the first to write after Luz. She wrote in jagged script. No punctuation. One line bleeding into the next. But each word cut deep into the page like a blade. I stayed silent for 14 years. Today I write not to accuse anyone, but to prove that I'm still here. Even after everything they called for the family's honor. Below her words, she drew a wilted flower, and next to it, a small green sprout rising. Then came Graciela, an elderly woman nearing 70, hair white as salt, abandoned in a nursing home by her children, for being no longer useful. She didn't write much, just one line. For the first time in 30 years, I ate dinner without being interrupted. One day, Luz went to the market and found a group of young girls waiting. They didn't say anything, just handed her an envelope. Inside were tiny scraps of folded paper, like butterflies tucked away. "These are our name writing exercises," one of them said. "You taught us, didn't you?" She laughed. For the first time. Not because of pain, but because she realized what she had planted was starting to bloom. That night, Altamirano made pumpkin stew and baked bread. They sat by the fire, reading new entries from the notebook. "I used to think love had to hurt. But here, I learned that love can also be gentle. I'm a mother of 3. But this is the first time someone asked me what my name was. I can't remember my real age anymore. But today, I remembered the first time I was slapped and told it's because I care." Altamirano looked at Luz and asked softly, "Do you think you're writing history?" She paused. "Not the kind that ends up in textbooks, but the kind no one ever writes down. Until now." He smiled. The firelight reflected on his face, and Luz noticed he had aged slightly. Not from time, but because he had come alive again. Every day in this house, among women who had never been allowed to say "I want," had been a kind of quiet rebirth. A kind he never expected. One night, there was a knock on the door. When Altamirano opened it, a thin girl stood there, her face smeared with ash, voice hoarse. "I once wanted to die." Luz stepped forward, not asking her name, not asking "Why didn't you?" She simply took the girl's hand and led her into the kitchen. That night, the girl wrote in the notebook, "They said I was a burden. Here, they handed me a basin of water, asked me to clean vegetables, and said I wasn't doing it evenly." For the first time, being criticized felt light. Not because I wasn't worth living, but because someone expected me to try. One morning, Luz stood on the porch, gazing at the hill where Altamirano's wife and daughter were buried. The wind was gentle, and she whispered, "I can't replace them, but I will keep this place alive as if they've never been forgotten." Altamirano said nothing, but he stepped outside and placed a small hammer in her hand. "Today we build more chairs," he said. "More people will come." "You think they'll come again?" "No," he replied. "I believe they're already on their way." What was once a quiet home on the edge of town where only Luz and Altamirano shared long silences, had now become a bright flame, impossible to ignore on Tierra Blanca's map of memory. Each night, the oil lamp in the kitchen burned late. Not just to illuminate hurried handwriting on paper, but as a beacon that whispered, "We are still here. And we are not asleep." One day, Pablo, the town's breadman, known for yelling at women who spoke too loudly, left a sack of bread on the doorstep. No message. But on the back, a slip of paper read, "The first time I heard my wife laugh was after she read something you wrote. I may not understand it, but I no longer want to stop her from laughing. Soledad, the seamstress who refused to even look at Luce when she first arrived, brought a basket of fabric scraps and said gruffly, "Got some leftovers? If you all wanna sew clothes for the kids, go ahead." Luce accepted the basket like receiving a wordless confession. And in that moment, she understood. Forgiveness is not forgetting the past, but offering someone the chance to create something new. Children began climbing the hill every Sunday morning. They called Luce the Story Lady, because every Saturday night, she lit the porch lamp and told stories about girls who could fly, old women who made rain, and a house that grew from tears. They were fairy tales on the surface, but each child somehow felt it mirrored someone in their own home. One rainy day, with mist covering the hill in gray, a bearded man arrived at Luce's door, backpack slung over his shoulder. He didn't say where he came from. He simply handed over a notebook, inside it a copy of her very first essay. "I read your piece by the fire one night. My daughter, she's only 10, asked me, 'Dad, do I get to write like that too?' I didn't know what to say. So the next morning, I went searching for this place." Luce didn't ask who he was. She simply handed him a pen and a blank sheet of paper. As dusk fell and golden light streamed through the trees, Altamirano brought out more chairs to the porch. 2 extra this time. When Luce looked at him, he shrugged. "We may never have enough chairs for everyone who's coming, but we can have enough space if everyone shares a little silence." That night, after reading through the letters in the nameless box, Luce picked up a blank sheet of paper and taped a note to the front door. "If you carry pain, come in. If you carry silence, take a seat. If your memories have been torn apart, write them again. Here, no one asks you to be perfect to be loved." Altamirano read the note, stood still for a long moment, then said, "Do you think the town is ready to change?" Luce looked up, the firelight from the hearth reflecting in her eyes. "I don't need the town to change. I just need the town to know we're no longer silent." As night fell, the lights inside the house still glowed. Not bright, but steady enough for the lost in the dark to find their way home. What had once been a place of escape was now a destination. One March morning, as fog clung to the trees in the north, Luce sat at the wooden table, holding a sheet of thick ivory paper, the kind she used only for the most important things. Before her was the old pen, its nib worn from writing hundreds of names. Names of those who once didn't dare say their own aloud. Today, she wasn't writing for herself, nor for any one woman. Today, Luce was writing for all the souls still wandering. The letter began like an invitation. If you're reading this and you've never come to the hill, know this: the hill is still here. Even if the winds change, even if people come and go, the hill remains. Not to teach, not to save, but to remind you. There is a place in this world where no one asks why you're tired, only that you sit and breathe. She paused, eyes drifting to Altamirano chopping wood on the porch. Still quiet, still strong, still patient. Like a wooden pillar that keeps a home from falling. People once asked me, why not build your house closer to town, so it's easier to connect with others? I answered, because those who have been wounded the deepest need a quiet road to walk before they can say anything real. On this hill, we don't heal anyone. We just sit beside each other, quietly, patiently, without interruption. And from there, miracles begin. She set down the pen. Her hand trembled not from weakness, but from realizing she had just written the last thing as someone who once survived. From today forward, she was not just surviving. She was living. Luz folded the letter and placed it in the wooden mailbox by the porch, where it would wait for anyone. At any time. For any reason. They would find it, and they would understand. You don't need permission to be yourself. That day, Luz and Altamirano built a large sign beside the path leading up the hill. A white painted board. Thick, bold black letters. Bienvenidos a la colina de la libertad. Welcome to the Hill of Freedom. There was no ribbon cutting. No music. No guests in suits. Only the wind. And the laughter of 3 children running around the outdoor kitchen, murmuring the fairy tales Luz had told the night before. That evening, after a simple meal, Luz sat by the fireplace. Her hand rested on Altamirano's now wrinkled, calloused, yet still as warm as the first day she touched it. "Do you think we've done enough?" she asked. He answered, eyes fixed on the flames. "When someone climbs this hill, takes a deep breath, and says, 'Finally, I don't have to hide anymore,' then everything you've done is enough." "And if I'm gone tomorrow?" she asked softly. Altamirano turned toward her, held her hand. "Then this hill will remain. And your name will be a light that never goes out." Luz smiled gently. Not a burning, exuberant smile, but one that was settled. Deep like a well. Still like a lake after the storm. That night, she wrote the final line in her notebook. "I was once born without a name. I was once called things I never chose. But now, I've given myself a name. And with that name, I no longer have to leave. I am Luz. And I'm staying." One early summer morning, as sunlight melted the last wisps of fog, Altamirano was watering the garden when he heard a knock at the door. Not frantic. Not shaky. Just 3 hesitant taps. As if the one knocking was asking the world, "Do I have the right to exist?" Luz opened it. On the porch stood a woman in her 40s, holding a newborn baby wrapped in a faded silver blanket. Her eyes were sunken. Lips cracked. But what stood out most was how tightly she held the baby. As if that child was the last thing anchoring her to the edge of a cliff. "Is this the place where no one asks your name?" Luz nodded. "It is. But if you want to share it, we have time." The woman was silent for a moment, then whispered, "My name is Mireya. But I forgot how to say it a long time ago." Luz gently took the bag from her hands, led her inside, and said, "Then let us help you remember." That afternoon, as Luz simmered porridge for the baby and Altamirano repaired the back door hinge, Mireya sat in front of an open notebook with a blank page. She held the pen for a long time. Didn't write. But Luz didn't rush her. By nightfall, under the golden glow of the kitchen light, she finally wrote, "I once believed I was the worst mother of them all. But today, as I carried my child up this hill, and no one asked me, 'Where's the father?' I knew, this is a place where I don't have to be perfect to be accepted. I'll stay. Not forever, but long enough for my child to know their mother once found a place called safe." Mireya's story became one of dozens added to the notebook in the months that followed. None were the same. But they all shared this. They came empty-handed, and left or stayed with a heart full of hope. One day, Luz built a small shelf by the porch. On it was a simple sign. Old memories, leave them here, if they're too heavy to carry. No one expected anyone to leave anything. Then came a broken wedding ring. An unsent letter that read, "I'm sorry I wasn't the daughter you wanted." A rusted fruit knife. Each item a bone fragment of a life once lived. That simple wooden shelf, humble, unadorned, became a resting place for what could not be said out loud. One evening, Altamirano stood on the roof watching the sunset. He said aloud, voice like a soliloquy to the sky, "Do you know, every time someone leaves here, they take a flower with them?" "I know," Luz replied. "Because I secretly slip one into their bag before they go." "Why not tell them?" "Because I want them to understand. Even if they never look back, someone behind them believed they were worthy of blooming." That night, Luz added another line to the notebook. "The next one will arrive, carrying their own version of darkness. But don't worry. We still have fire. And the chair by the stove has never gone cold." And in the attic of that small wooden house, Luz and Altamirano hung a large lantern lit with vegetable oil and mirror fragments to reflect the light far into the valley below. Not to light anyone's path, but to send a message to every wandering soul in the night. There is still light here. And if you need a place to begin again, this is your starting point. That winter came earlier than usual. Northern winds swept down the hill like they meant to erase every footprint. But Luz's wooden home never closed its doors. The fire never went out. Every morning still rang with the sounds of tea brewing, firewood cracking, and children skipping across the porch. Until one day Luz fell ill. Not suddenly. Not tragically. Just the kind of tiredness that people who have fought too long tend to hide. Until their body can't keep the silence anymore. Altamirano carried her to the small bamboo bed. Her face still glowed. But her eyes, they had grown deeper. Like they held the history of women whose stories had never been written down. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "No," she whispered. "It just feels like I'm between two worlds. And both of them feel like home." People came up the hill. Not because Luz was about to pass away, but because something in their hearts told them they had to return the light she had once given. The mute woman who had lived 6 years in silence after being assaulted placed a painting on the altar. It showed her and Luz, hand in hand. The little girl once abandoned on the road to the hill, now a third-grade student, stood by the window humming the lullaby Luz had taught her. Altamirano stood among them, saying nothing. But he placed his hands on each person's shoulders, as if to say, "She lives in each of you." One final night, Luz called Altamirano to her side. She handed him a new notebook, thick, blank, untouched. "The old one's nearly full," she said. "I can't keep writing. Can you take over for me?" "But I'm not good with words." "You don't have to be. Just promise me this, don't let anyone leave quietly." At dawn the next morning, Luz closed her eyes. No cry. No tear. Just the lantern on the desk still glowing. And when the first light of day slipped through the crack in the door, it touched her face. And it was as if the whole room lit up from within. Luz was gone. But the hill of freedom remained. 3 months later, a group of women from another town came to the hill. They were led by those who had once survived here. They brought their own stories, their own grief. But they all knew they no longer had to begin again alone. And the new notebook, this time with a carved cover that read, "Luz, a light that never goes out," began its first page. I arrived the day the founder was laid to rest. But I did not find morning. I found a home filled with light. A hill burning with fire. And I knew I had found where I belonged. Luce is gone. But what she left behind was not walls, doors, or notebooks. She left a fire. Alive in hundreds of people. Spreading still. Through every story told. Every word written. Every chair left empty. For the one who comes late. And you. If one day you feel lost. Unsure of where you belong. Remember this. There is a place. Somewhere. On a hill where the wind howls freely. Where a lantern is always lit. Waiting for you to come home. No questions. No names required. Just a heartbeat that still wants to live. If this story touched your heart. Comment 1 if you've ever known someone like Luce. Comment 2 if you are someone searching for a hill to begin again. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more stories of faith, survival, and light in the darkness. Share this video because somewhere out there, a soul might be waiting for just one spark to keep from giving up.